Thank you for coming.
Glad to be
Pleased
here.
to have you with us. Here in the studio are George Will and Sam Donaldson, both of ABC News. Now, you are one of the most respected scientists in this field. Tell me as best you can, I know this is somewhat guesswork, what's going to happen in Rio? What are we going to get out of it?
The Earth Summit is about the recognition on the part of world leaders that environmental protection is going to be at the top of the global political agenda in the 21st century, right along with security concerns and economic concerns. And that's as it should be, because no nation...
Let me interrupt. What security concerns? What are they in this context? What does that mean?
Well, traditional security concerns mean military security, of course. But no nation in the future can feel secure, for instance, if its coastlines are being constantly eroded by rising sea level brought on by global warming, or if its food supplies are being disrupted, or if it's threatened by a potential flood of refugees from other countries, like the countries of Eastern Europe, whose economies are being undermined by environmental degradation.
George?
Just a moment ago, as we came to the questioning here, they ran a little tease for World News Tonight, and it said something about discouraging the third world from developing the way we did. Isn't it in our interest for them to develop the way we did? Because don't you need rapid growth to develop a social surplus so you can afford to devote social wealth to environmental concern?
It's in our interest, and we wouldn't be able to stop it anyway, for the poorer countries, which only are responsible for about 20% of the globe's pollution, to develop. But they should develop according to a different path, a different industrial prescription than we did. We, 20% of the world, in the wealthy countries, are responsible for 80% of the pollution. If China, where there's one car for every 500 people, gets the same kind of cars and the same ratio of cars to people that the United States does, where there's one car for every 2 people, the world is essentially going to go through the roof environmentally. We can't let that happen.
Well, a lot of what's going on in Rio and in your conversation is the premise that some people consider a lot of hubris. That is that you know the future and you know the possibilities of the planet. And it's implied in this phrase, sustainable growth, that's written throughout the document down here. Let me read you a phrase from the draft principles of this global partnership we're working on in Rio. To achieve sustainable development and a higher quality for all the peoples, states should reduce and eliminate unsustainable patterns of production and consumption and promote appropriate demographic policies. Who knows these things? Who knows what's sustainable growth?
Well, we know some things about the past from the way the industrial world developed, patterns we oughtn't to reproduce. The worst of it is what we see in Eastern Europe, where, for instance, Western companies won't even go in and invest now because of the terrible situation with the environment. What gain was it for them to develop an economy based very heavily on inefficient use of fossil fuels, worse than the United States? But the United States is, of course, very inefficient in its use of fossil fuels also. What good did it do them if now that they've got free market economies, they can't even get companies to invest? So that's the end point. We've got to keep developing countries from going too far along that path.
But sustainable growth implies, against all our record of bad predictions, that we know how much fuels there are, we know what we're going to need in the future, we know what we're going to discover or develop. We don't.
You can't predict or project the future with high accuracy, but you know certain forms of behavior are better than others, both with regard to the environment and with regard to the economy. The simplest example is being more efficient in the use of energy. Energy inefficiency, as The Economist said this week, is bad for the economy. It wastes income. Our chief economic competitors like Japan and Germany are twice as efficient in the use of energy as we are. That's part of the reason they have a leg up, competitively speaking. We've got, if we're going to help the developing countries develop in a way that's sound, good for the environment, good for their economies, we've got to help them be more efficient in their use of resources like energy.
You began here today by saying countries can no longer just look at security and economic concerns, but the environmental concerns will be right up there also. But of course, you have lost the superpower, the United States. You environmentalists did not win there. The Bush administration has beaten you on the 2 major treaties in Rio. One, global warming, was toned down to please President Bush. The other, the Species Treaty, the United States won't even sign.
It's just the first round. So although a couple of skirmishes have been lost, there's a much larger battle which is being waged. And the war has only begun. It's only over the last few years that the shape of these problems has even been appreciated. 5 years ago, nobody even understood, outside of a small number of scientists, what global warming, for instance, was about. The trouble is that progress will continue to be slowed until the U.S. shows leadership. The U.S. is the largest country in terms of its economy. It is politically the most powerful country in the world, and it is the biggest polluter. Until this administration realizes its responsibility, there's no reason that other countries should move very far. If the 800-pound gorilla isn't going to move, yes, other countries are going to lag behind. But in spite of that, there is some substance. There's more than symbolism to this process.
Mr. Oppenheimer, a lot of Americans are out of work. Perhaps some of them are watching our program today. And it's very difficult saying to them, and we're going to put more of you out of work, and we're going to require industry to move very quickly now at the economic expense of this country and your jobs, because that's the opposition, as you well know, to tough controls for the year 2000 and global warming.
Helping the environment is not about hurting the economy. The administration itself published a document a month ago which indicated a whole set of strategies which can both save money and reduce global warming, for instance, at the same time. The whole sustainable development concept means finding those strategies that do both at once, and we have barely scratched the surface.
One other question. You are a scientist. We now read the paper that, in fact, maybe global warming, because of the volcano in the Philippines, is reversed. And we're going to get cooler.
Temporarily for about 2 years, but there's no question about the long-term trend.
There is a question about the long-term trend. You said a moment ago to Sam that 5 years ago we did not understand the global warming. 20 years ago we were worried about global cooling. Today there are lots of scientists say we don't understand what's happening in the climate of the world. Are you sure that there's what you'd call a settled scientific consensus on this?
The global warming problem, the proposition that burning coal would eventually lead to the warming of the Earth, is 100 years old. It shouldn't be any surprise that over that period of time there have been different opinions about where climate was going over the next 5 years or over the next 10 years. But in the past 2 decades, there is a consensus represented again in a report out of the White House a month ago, which said, quote, that there is a consensus among a broad range of scientists, including a majority of U.S. scientists, that we're building up the greenhouse gases, and this will lead to a warming of the Earth in the range of 3 degrees to 8 degrees Fahrenheit over the next century. That would make Earth warmer than any time in the history of the human species, and it would be a faster warming than any in the history of civilization. That's a threat we need to act on now.
Mr. Oppenheimer, thank you on that glum and gloomy note. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Coming next, Senator Albert Gore, Democrat, Tennessee, head of the Senate's delegation to the Earth Summit. And shortly, William Reilly, head of the Environmental Protection Agency, in a moment.
But who just wants to survive?
Honeywell, helping you control your world.
Our local playground safe for children, Monday at 6.
Senator Gore, you're in California. Welcome. Pleased to have you.
Thank you, David.
I'm glad you could come. Now tell me this. Here in Washington, what we hear the view expressed at some very high levels, it seems that in the Rio conference, the third world countries are eager to have other countries' money to clean up theirs. Is that right? What do you
Well,
think of that?
the old rhetoric of North versus South is giving way to a new realization within the developing countries that this global environmental crisis threatens them very severely. Also, they recognize that some 80% of the money spent to deal with it is going to come from the developing countries. And there's a new realism, I think, developing on their part that the North is not going to pick up the tab for all of the problems that they have created themselves, but there must be a partnership between North and South, and it's in our economic as well as environmental interest to do so.
Mr. Oppenheimer, who was just here, and I assume you heard Senator Gore, talked about the environmental destruction in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, and it does seem that where market forces have been least respected and government most enlarged, the environment has suffered most. What worries a lot of people is that the recipe for environmentalism as defined at the Rio conference seems to imply an awful lot more government regulation, and people don't have a lot of confidence in the government's ability to foresee the niceties of what it calls sustainable growth. Should people be worried about that?
I think it's ironic, George, that so many conservatives feel that the environmental crisis is an exaggerated excuse for statism, the expansion of government power. because most environmentalists who have spent time looking at this crisis around the world identify governments as more responsible than perhaps any other institutions. I and others have argued that the expansion of economic freedom and self-government are prerequisites for the solving of this environmental crisis. And indeed, Eastern Europe is one of the important examples why. But in the developing world, you'll find the environmentalists are always, almost always, Democrats working for political freedom and economic reforms at the same time.
It's unclear to me what people will be committed to, what nations will be committed to in the way of trimming their sovereignty and obeying by international community decisions. Let me read you Principle 2 of the draft as it was at least recently. States have, in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations and the principles of international law, the sovereign right to exploit their own resources pursuant to their own environmental and developmental policies, comma, and then it goes on to say, and the responsibility to do so wisely. What exactly, if exactly anything, does that commit anyone to?
Well, ironically, the Bush administration objected to that particular statement. But let me get to your philosophical point, because I think it's very important. There is an undefined fear, again, on the part of many conservatives, that this whole movement is leading toward a surrender of sovereignty to some supranational entity. I don't know of many people who are arguing in favor of that. What's contemplated is a series of agreements within which nations voluntarily agree to bind themselves to common standards, as we did in the Montreal Protocol, which began this process of phasing out the chemicals that destroy the stratospheric ozone layer. Unfortunately, in the treaties that have been designed for signature at Rio, President Bush prevented the world from reaching some meaningful commitments that would get this process off to a good start. These agreements are going to be mainly symbolic, but they'll be important nonetheless.
Senator, the administration was able to tone down the global warming treaty so that there will not be enforceable curbs by the year 2000 on the number of emission carbon dioxide and other emissions into the atmosphere. If you were sitting in the White House today and our industrialists came to you and said, we just can't do this without throwing a lot of people out of work, without losing in an economic sense for this country, what would you say to them?
I'd say, why is it that the largest Japanese business organization, the Keidan-Ren, is arguing for much tougher limits on pollution than those embodied in U.S. law? Are they just soft-headed in Japan about international business competition? Or do they know something that we don't? In fact, the Japanese and the Germans are now saying openly that the biggest new market in the history of world business is the market for the new products and processes that make possible economic progress without the destruction of the environment. You know, the report came out a couple of weeks ago that 35% of U.S. exports last year were to developing countries. That is the fastest growing market in the world. And yet in places like Mexico City, our neighbor to the south, they're shutting down factories with old technology, not because of the economy, but because people are choking to death on the pollution. They are desperate to acquire the new generation of machines and technologies that will make this development possible without adding to the burden of pollution. Japan and Europe are gearing up to create millions of jobs in satisfying that market. We need to do the same thing instead of just protecting polluters who are operating with outdated approaches because they have a short-term viewpoint.
Well, why do you think President Bush brought on to his advisors that part of them which won the day on the economic side? Clearly, he doesn't just want to protect polluters per se.
Oh, I think that it's a short-term viewpoint versus a long-term viewpoint. We're at a turning point, Sam, right now. This Earth Summit conference is the first of many that will take place, and they're comparable to the round of discussions and agreements after 1945, like Bretton Woods and the San Francisco UN conference. The task of saving the Earth's environment is going to become the central organizing principle in the post-Cold War world. The United States should be leading this new movement. We are looked to by the rest of the world for leadership, but President Bush has abdicated that responsibility and instead is focusing on the short-term objections of those who want to hang on to outdated, polluting ways of the past.
Senator,
Polluting ways of the past.
Senator, I'd like to recur to what you said about the Japanese. You said the Japanese business organization is not soft-headed, you're implying. They're hard-headed in advocating tougher standards. Some people would say precisely they are using, and there's a pattern of this in the world already, they are using environmental standards to gain international competitive economic advantage. Isn't there a danger that that people are going to use environmental standards this way, and are we not going to come up with a conflict between our international free trade requirements and our national and international environmental standards?
Well, first of all, there's no inevitable conflict between free and equitable trading arrangements and environmental protection. There's a premature clash that people are arguing about, but it doesn't have to happen. Let me come to the central point that you make, though. You remember when we first started dealing with air pollution and we set some standards, the apocryphal story was that every American automobile company went out and hired 50 new lawyers, and every Japanese automobile company went out and hired 50 new engineers. They were not using regulations to make more efficient, higher quality automobiles in that era. They were responding to a market demand that they perceived a little bit earlier than we did. We're now catching up very aggressively in that case. But we're going to fall way behind the curve on industrial machinery, electric generating machinery, the whole gamut of industrial equipment and processes, if we don't recognize, as the Japanese and the Europeans are recognizing, that people throughout the world now understand that we have an environmental crisis. We have to change the relationship between civilization and the Earth's environment. Right. And technology, new technology, is going to be one of the important parts of the solution. Senator, millions of jobs are at stake in this country unless we have the leadership to move forward rapidly.
Senator Gore, thank you. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Thanks.
Coming next, the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, William Reilly, in a moment.
In 1862, the average American farmer fed 5 people for 1 year. Today, he feeds more than 90, not just Americans, but people around the world as well. Obviously, as a leading processor of food ingredients, we at the Archer Daniels Midland Company couldn't survive without the American farmer. But then, neither could you.
A level of interest, I think, obviously on issues that are as far-ranging, that affect so many. Economic concerns, considerations, for example, differ. And there's no question that a number of countries played the negotiations to different effect. I think that the world, however, will win from this conference a whole range of things that have gotten less attention, perhaps, than the climate or even the biological diversity convention in recent days. There are commitments going to be made to improving understanding of the oceans. There are commitments to be made to community right to know, freedom of information, no regulation, no government intervention, something that has been very powerful in the United States, where releases of information about toxic pollution are annually made available throughout the world. It's a major step forward. One of the achievements I think we're like to get there is a commitment on the part of a lot of developing countries to the use of economic instruments. I don't think we've ever seen that word in a UN document before. That is based on United States experience. We are incentivizing pollution controls, just as we did in the Clean Air Act, and it will be a contribution we'll make from what has been a largely successful environmental experience in America.
Let's take a practical subject here. There's been hell to pay, still is hell to pay, over the decision of how to accommodate the spotted owl and the needs of the logging community in the West. It's been hard enough for our representative democracy to cope with that one issue. Will anything come out of the Rio Conference, or the process that the Rio Conference initiates, that is going to add a third party to this dispute, or disputes like the spotted owl and the logging dispute? That is, will we in future have to weigh the policy we want against international requirements that are now being generated that will impinge upon, say, the spotted owl in Washington?
We worked very hard in crafting the agreements that we have signed up for in Rio to make sure they're sensitive to economic concerns and to the basic interests of the United States. The problem with respect to the spotted owl is to protect the species consistent with the Endangered Species Act, which is stronger than any biological diversity requirement of any country in the world I'm aware of, but to do so sensitively, to respect the fact that jobs are involved here, as we did a few weeks ago when we made an exception to it as an administration.
But the question is, will there be an international component in our decision-making? Will we have a new obligation to weigh as we try and set our national policy towards spotted owls or whatever?
Well, there's no question that we have made a commitment in the Climate Convention, which President Bush will sign in Rio, to move toward stabilization of greenhouse gases. That is a moral obligation. We are now going to undertake the efforts. We've already begun them. A number of the measures necessary to achieve that result are already in effect, already in law, such as the Clean Air Act, and that will be an important consideration. I think what that treaty says to the governments of the world as to industry is be much more careful about decisions to use energy. This is now a concern not just of environmentalists, it's a concern of governments the world over.
Other nations wanted to commit by the year 2000 to holding pollutants to the 1990 levels. But the administration, by using the threat to withhold the presidential visit as a blackjack, which you say was your tactic, got it watered down. Why isn't it fair to say that this administration has sold out to the polluters?
We have begun, I think, a very historic process. If you look back at the progress we've made since 1985, when the Vienna Convention was signed to eliminate chlorofluorocarbons, these ozone-depleting chemicals, that progress moved very fast, and yet the convention that began the process had a lot less by way of commitments in it than this climate treaty. What we did in the U.S. position, which has prevailed with respect to targets and timetables, is to make commitments we are absolutely certain we can and will honor. I think that's a respectable position in international affairs.
Mr. Administrator, you haven't made a commitment except, as you put it, to move forward, to move toward.
We have made a commitment to action plans. We've made a commitment to emissions monitoring. The developing countries, for the first time now, have made a commitment to monitor their own emissions, which are not well understood. This is a very important process, and I think over time, if the science continues to come in, as it has, you will see us respond to it.
Why should anyone believe us, meaning the United States, when it now says it has a commitment to move forward? In mid-May, the Clean Air Act, which is law in this country, and which you argued vigorously with the administration ought to be enforced, an exemption was given for pollutants. You lost that battle. So why should we believe that the administration...
I'm not sure what kind of exemption it was. If you're talking about the public participation in the minor permits amendments...
Well, the public was to be notified in advance, and you argued that that ought to be followed. And the Vice President and his Competitiveness Council, which many believe ought to be renamed Big Business Council, won.
We have had our differences within the administration. These are obviously significant issues. They affect a lot of considerations and sometimes entail a lot of cost. But let's keep it in perspective. The granting of permits initially will have the full range of public participation, notice, opportunity for hearing, comment, and the rest. It's only these so-called minor permit amendments on which I had a different position.
Well, it was so minor, I was just going to ask you, why did you fight so vigorously on the other side?
I considered it important, and my own
counsel...
Why
not say that today?
My own counsel advised me with respect to the law. The Justice Department, which is the final arbiter of things legal, came to a different conclusion about the requirements of the law. And so did the President. I accept that and we'll move on. But minor permits amendment, the sun will still rise in the east. This is not a major undercutting of the Clean Air Act.
Is that what they said to you when you lost the fight? Did they say, Bill, the sun will still rise in the east. Stop this silly nonsense of yours?
No, the sun will rise in the east is an insight of mine, actually.
It's an insight first developed by a previous administration concerning the United Nations.
This administration, in this area, has made very significant commitments, has set records in enforcement, has come up with the Clean Air Act, proposed it, pushed it through, is
Why wouldn't
vigorously
you sign the
implementing.
Species Act, for instance, in Rio?
The President will announce tomorrow a major initiative affecting worldwide forestry. He will refer back to the fact that in 1990, in Houston at the G7 summit, he first proposed a worldwide convention on forestry. Developing countries are not ready for that. All right, they're ready perhaps for a statement of principles on good forest management practices. Those countries that do in fact enter into that process, that work toward a convention, we will begin to work with in new partnerships, significantly increasing the United States' support for wise forestry and conservation, and we hope bringing the rest of the world to do as much.
How much money?
In excess of $100 million a year.
He's going to announce this tomorrow, you said,
That's
that
right.
the plants and animals.
He will announce tomorrow a major new thrust to increase protection of forests, which are the major repositories of plants.
Is that why you're wearing that tie with strings of elephants on it? Can you come in tight on that, David, on the tie? It's a black tie with what look like gold elephants. It's pretty cute.
Could be political.
Well, if I may just, 98
Go ahead,
countries
Sam.
helped negotiate the species treaty. And the United States, by being unwilling to sign it, is once again sending the signal. Not us, not the big boy in the block.
We could not have made it more clear that we want a biological diversity convention. We have, in fact, the strongest protections for species and for plants and animals in the United States of any country in the world. However, the negotiations resulted in a treaty that we cannot accept, not because it has too strong commitments to the protection of biological diversity, but because it threatens to blow away intellectual property rights and have no regard for our patents, and to take a specialized approach to biotechnology, a technology in which the United States leads the world, and which we believe is going to have great economic but also environmental advantages.
George, we've got a few seconds left.
When the United States moved against the importation of Mexican tuna because Mexican tuna fishermen were killing dolphins, in other words, we had an environmental reason for interfering with free trade, we were reprimanded by an international agency for interfering with free trade rules. Isn't this going to be a multiplying conflict? And what's more important to this country, freedom of trade or environmental standards?
You know, the trade now in environmental technologies is in excess of $100 billion a year. The United States has 40% of that trade. It's rising to $300 billion in the coming years. I think we should not overlook the fact that the advantages we have, because we've set standards high with respect to automobile pollution, have given us exports, catalytic converters, that now the rest of the world wants, clean, green growth.
Mr. Reilly, thank you. Thanks very much for coming. I wish you luck.
Thank you. Pleasure
Come
to be
again.
here.
Coming next, our discussion here with everyone free to say whatever he wants on condition that he answer the mail. And joining us will be Cokie Roberts of ABC News in a moment.
Imagine your refrigerator with bigger door shelves for bigger bottles, with leftovers left in quick-serve trays for leftover space, more space, nearly 27 cubic feet, and a door in the door for things you use more. Imagine GE's Space Center 27.
At the Laporte Vineyards, owners Victor and Beth Laporte knew varietal grapes, but profit sharing and pension plans they knew little about. So they turned to someone who gave their financial needs the same care they accorded their wine, Dean Witter.
Where we invest is in the individual. What we invest is our time, our expertise, and our care.
So the Laportes can now not only enjoy success, they can taste it. Dean Witter.
We measure success one investor at a time.
Look what ADM research has cooked up. An all-vegetable patty that contains dietary fiber, is low in fat, and free of cholesterol. One that's made to meet the demands of vegetarians and other health-conscious consumers. It's the Midland Harvest brand Harvest Burger. And so far, it's made a big impression everywhere it's landed. ADM, supermarket to the world.
The art of brewing is about control. Controlling the process, the quality of the ingredients.
Every little detail.
That's how we bring you a great beer.
Well, once it leaves here,
You're the one in control.
We want you to enjoy our beer.
at a ball game, a barbecue.
At dinner with the family.
After work with friends.
But please, drink responsibly. Remember, friends know when to say when.
We'd all appreciate it.
A reminder from the people who bring you Budweiser.
It's us and them. You're sick and your surgeon may be lying to you about his record and experience. Chris Wallace reports on A Doctor's Report Card. Watch Primetime Thursday.
What could 2020 have found out about this POW hunter to make him this angry? Watch 2020 and find out Friday.